A little over a year ago, I began work on a brand new game. I wanted to work on something smaller than my previous projects, so I decided to give myself a strict timeline of 100 days to have a completed game. So here we are 1 year later, and it seems I may have gotten a little carried away. I'm making a game where you pissed off every god from every mythology, and you stack items and make alliances to fight back. It's called MythoMania, and it has combat inspired by games like Hollow Knight, item system inspired by Risk Grand 2, and a bunch of other things that I think are kinda cool. I'm a college student, so I haven't been able to work on my game every day. So I've just been tracking the days that I can actually put aside to get work done. So though I've had only 173 days of development, a year has passed since I started working on the game. This video is a summary of the first year of development. It's also an easy way to get caught up with where I am right now in development, so if you want to keep up with development from now on, then be sure to watch this and subscribe, as I'll be having a new demo out soon. I'm also making this game with the help and input of my community, so be sure to comment any suggestions that you want me to add to the game, and I might listen. But anyways, let's go back to day 1 and cover all the development that brought me up to the current day. At the start, I was focused on making a solid base to build on for the rest of development. Having fun core gameplay is very important to me, so I first put together a very nice polished player movement controller using Taro Dev's player controller as a base. Then I added slashes, dashes, screen shake, and some basic enemies. I decided to focus on game feel from the very beginning of development, which isn't something that is usually suggested. So I added things like animations, sound effects, particles, and screen shakes really early in development. But I think it kind of paid off, as it made it more fun for me to playtest, and also gave me a better idea of how the final game will feel to play. I then started to add some enemies to the game, starting with a simple goblin. One of the most ubiquitous creatures across all folklores. They go by many different names and looks, but in my game I settled for the classic green look. Don't forget the nipples. I also added the first ranged enemy, which is a centaur from Greek mythology, and they shoot an arrow and an arc that definitely didn't take me literally forever to get right. Finally, I added a flying enemy, the Japanese Nobusuma, who's basically just a big bat that loves blood. But that's not all. I also began laying the groundwork for item and inventory system, and looking back, this is probably the most important mechanic I made for the game. And I'm glad that I got it mostly correct from the beginning. Items can have a variety of effects, like improving stats, spawning objects, creating stats effects, and more. Plus they can stack. There are all sorts of little numbers and functions that I can tinker with. It was a headache and a half to put it together, but I can confidently say it was worth every second, as I've now made over 40 items with the system. So it was a pretty productive first month or so. But I was quickly realizing that the game would probably take a little longer than the 100 days I had hoped for. But that's fine, surely I'll catch up later. At this point, I shifted my focus to making some content with all the systems I had designed, with my main goal being to figure out how to make items for the game that were actually useful and fun. Some of my favorite items that I made for the game are made here, like an item that increases the amount of damage you deal to an enemy for each unique stats effect they have on them, encouraging you to get tons of different stats effects to improve your damage. And I also made some that really just didn't feel right, like an item that gives you a chance to dodge attacks, which might work for a game like Risk of Rain, but it feels janky and unfair in my game, where you're supposed to avoid damage more often. But it was good that I learned these things early on in development, so I could set a few rules for how items should work. And I also added 2 new enemies, the Daitengu, who is a Japanese yokai who attacks with a big sword, and the Egyptian flying snake, who shoots poison projectiles at the player. I also added a few new mechanics to the game that were mostly built on existing things, like a combo system that rewards killing enemies quickly while avoiding damage, enemy level scaling to keep the difficulty scaling upwards as the game goes on, and I allowed you to lock a chest that you want but can't afford yet to keep it from disappearing whenever you start the new wave and allow you to save up. Finally, I began to build the first real boss fight of the game with Ares, putting together a system with multiple attacks and then designing a fight with Ares. The only problem was that it barely worked and it wasn't really all that fun. So I was making progress with the game, but I was also beginning to run into the first real hurdles, as I had accidentally made it way too easy for the player to snowball and get a god run, where they could buy every single item and instantly clear the entire screen. I also had problems with making a good boss fight, but overall progress is still being made even if that 100-day deadline kept getting closer. At the 50-day mark, I continued to focus on polish and adding new content, and one of my favorite things that I've added to the game was also implemented here: familiars. Inspired by Pokemon, familiars are a unique item type, which are little guys that follow you around. And like Pokemon, they evolve. They level up each time you stack their item. So unlike other items which gain the same thing on each stack of the item, which is usually an increase to the stat related to the item, these familiars can have different effects for each level, and I can make some levels bigger upgrades than others, making the familiars into an investment that will pay off as you reach the higher levels. I also did a bunch of rebalancing and reworking for the Ares fight, making him more aggressive and fun to play against. and also less janky. And I also added the very first familiar to the game, the Shneke, which are creatures in Mexican folklore who guard dangerous places. It's a pretty simple first familiar. It just shoots out a burst of leaves and flies around, but I think it's a good proof of concept. I also implemented a brand new system for progression, the player upgrade system. The player currently has a few basic attacks, a slash, and a long-range projectile, so I figured it'd be interesting to let the player customize and upgrade these attacks over the course of their run, similar to the hammer system in Hades. So I added them to the game, adding upgrades for charge attack, seeking projectiles, and piercing projectiles. Though looking back, the seeking projectiles were kind of absolutely busted, and they ruined the bounce of the game for a while after. And while I also added some fun content, like a few new items and the Boy Tata, a fiery Brazilian snake enemy, I was beginning to run into the first big hurdle for my game, bouncing. It was very difficult for me to get the game into a state where the amount of enemies spawning per wave wasn't too chaotic, but was still challenging. And this is something that I've continued to tinker with up to the current day, but for days 76 to 100, I focused on getting the game into a presentable state. So the first thing that I had to change was all the nasty art. So I did major art passes for the library, items, and the first stage, Mount Olympus. I implemented some lighting, parallax backgrounds, more sounds, more particles, and I created a Steam page for the game, which you can reach using a link in the description. So please wishlist if you're interested, as wishlisting is the best way to support my game as it helps out in Steam's algorithm. I also started work on the second stage at this time, prototyping water mechanics for the new Norse theme stage, and I improved the UI and implemented controller support. And I also continued my endless battle with bouncing, implementing a system that reduces the amount of money the enemies drop as the stage goes on, making it so that you can still buy things at the beginning, but you don't have practically infinite money by the end of the stage. And honestly, though I didn't think this would be fun, it worked really well and isn't too noticeable. So it's another tool I can use to fine-tune my game's balance. And on day 100, I released the game. This is what I would say, but I obviously didn't. This is nowhere near done. Yeah, turns out game development takes a while, who would I guessed. So these first 100 days were productive, but the game has a lot of issues right now, so I simply released an early demo to get some feedback and went right back to development. And over the next period of development, I focused on fleshing out the Norse area, adding rain particles, breakable barrels, and a gnome throwing gnome. Yeah, this isn't really something that ever happens in Nordic folklore, but I figured that gnomes have pointy hats, and so they probably work pretty well as projectiles. And here we are. I also added a new system in Spider Risk of Rain 2, which allows the player to take more control over their build. You can exchange items which you don't want for gems, with more rare items giving you more gems. And then you can exchange those gems for items at trading booths. Pretty neat. I focused on making items which properly fit into different builds at this point, adding items like the Dragon King, which is a familiar that grows in power with each other familiar that you have. And in turn, the Dragon King buffs all those familiars, making them really powerful for a familiar build. I then more or less finished up the Norse area, adding a unique water enemy, the Shiofuki, who is a Japanese yokai that shoots seeking bullets. It was also at this point that I was beginning to realize just how many items I would have in the game. And so, needing a better method of keeping track of them, I made a big spreadsheet. That way, I can plan out future items, balance existing ones, and make sure I have a somewhat balanced spread of items across categories, helping players to get good builds with good synergies. I also decided to experiment with a new sort of item which have stronger benefits than other items of the same rarity, but also have drawbacks. This should lead to more risky decision making, as well as incentivize you to pick up these items which have drawbacks to cover holes in your builds, but then recycle them into gems later whenever you can replace them with other items. I also added the first new character to the game, Wu Qingyan, author of the Chinese epic Journey to the West. He's got parries and a combo attack, and landing his parries and slashes builds up charges of his special attack, which you can hold down to release a storm of seeking arrows. And Homer, the first character and the poet behind the Odyssey, also received a bit of a facelift, as they added a new special slam attack which deals more damage the more times you pogo on enemies. And so this encourages the aerial playstyle, where you take advantage of a strong primary attack and high bounce height. And lastly, I implemented a dialogue system where you can listen to characters and respond, which allows for bits of characterization before and after you fight gods, but more importantly, it will be used when I actually finally create the final central mechanic of the game, making alliances with the gods. Around this time, I also started commissioning portraits for all the gods in the game, and my artist Delete created these great pieces which I can use for dialogue. And yeah, that just about catches you up to the most recent devlog. So be sure to subscribe for whenever I release the next devlog in a few weeks, and once again, feel free to make suggestions for the game. I especially like implementing people's suggestions for enemies and items into the game, so comment them down below. But that's all. Thanks for watching. Bye.